Welcome back to the Word for the Valley podcast, and we're following along with Pastor Mike through the Gospel of Matthew. And in today's passage, we step into one of the most unfair and unjust moments in the entire Bible. It's the kind of event that exposes corruption, abuse of power, and the deep darkness of the human heart. And yet, in the middle of this tragedy, Matthew is setting the stage for something important: how Jesus responds to the world at its very worst. Let's follow along with Pastor Mike as we begin at chapter 14, verse 1.
Now, I'm going to ask you a question. I don't typically do this. This is actually a congregational response, all right? You're going to raise your hand if, in fact, you are one of those people who are really concerned with being fair, all right? Meaning, that's not fair, or I don't understand why this is allowed to go on. Are you a person who considers things based on what should be right and what should be wrong and whether or not it's fair or not? Raise your hand if you are a fair person. About half. That's kind of what I was guessing. Not everybody is that way. But usually people who are pretty doggedly determined that it ought to be that way, kind of thing, right? There is a right and there is a wrong, and if it's not right, it's not fair. That's usually kind of how people like that think. I am a bit that way. My oldest son is that way worse than I am. It's black and white, and it's boom, and that's kind of thing, and it's good for him in many ways because right is right, and that's what he does. But if it's not fair, he's already been into the dean's office this year regarding COVID and the vaccine mandates, and he's appealed to everybody. He's done all kinds of research. He's just the nut that way. I love it. It's perfect. And so Evan, and really appreciate it. But some people are really geared that way. What we're going to look at here this morning is a situation that I, in my heart, see as one of the most unfair things that happens to anybody in all of the Bible. It seems so unjust, so unrighteous, so unfair, that for some people you would look at a situation like this and just say, if this is what the Roman Empire is, literally, to hell with it. Let them go. Let them die. Let them just release it. Let it go. Right? It's so unfair. It's so unjust. It's the epitome of unrighteous. And so we'll see it here as we set the stage. And then watch how Jesus responds to that in the following story. It says in verse 1 of chapter 14, at that time, Herod, this is Herod Antipas, the tetrarch, heard about the report of Jesus. Now, Herod Antipas is one of the sons, and Herod the Great had many of them, but he is one of the sons of Herod the Great. He's a tetrarch here, which means that he has control or power over a quarter of the region that Herod the Great had. So Herod the Great basically governed the entire Palestinian region. A portion of that is given to Herod Antipas, and then Herod the Great gives three other sons the other quarters of the tetrarchy to govern the area. Herod Antipas is one of those men. Now, he's hearing report about Jesus, which means that the ministry of Jesus has grown to such a degree that it's actually leaked back into the White House, or into Herod's house anyway, and they're hearing what's happening in regards to the ministry of Jesus. Now, Herod Antipas thinks about it like this in verse 2. He said to his servants, this is John the Baptist. This is his thought, his conviction. This is John the Baptist. He has risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work in him. So Herod Antipas reasons there's a guy doing all of these great miracles. It must be reincarnated John the Baptist. And now, I don't know is this occultish? Is this a genuine, he really thought that people got reincarnated this way, or that spirits kind of hung around after they died? Is it mere superstition? Is it hyperbole? I don't know. But it sets the stage for what we're going to see here. All right? Herod Antipas believes that Jesus is actually John the Baptist back from the dead. Now, the reason why he would believe that is based on what he had done. It says in verse 3, Herod had laid hold of John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. Now, Herod had obviously been unjust, unfair to John the Baptist merely by putting him into the prison, okay? You can tell in this whole scene that Herod Antipas is dealing with a very guilty conscience. Right? He knows what he had done to John is wrong, and it's going to get worse in the story. He didn't just put him into prison. He will eventually have him executed there. Herod Antipas is dealing with that. I don't think we should ever discount or minimalize the ability of God to bring conviction to the people at the highest levels of governing power, right? We can oftentimes think, well, they're getting away with it. It doesn't, listen, there's still a conscience. Until it gets fully seared, God can still work, right? Pilate's wife had dreams about Jesus, right? God can communicate to the people at the highest levels in whatever way he sees fit. We just wish oftentimes that maybe they would listen more, right, kind of thing. But he still is working even there. And Herod is dealing with a guilty conscience. Now, what actually precipitated this arrest of John the Baptist is this. Herod had married Herodias. Herodias is a woman's name, by the way. Okay, just so you know, okay? His brother Philip's wife. So Philip was another one of the tetrarchs. He was another governing ruler of one of those 4 regions. And Philip had married Herodias, who happened to be Herod Philip's niece. This is a very weird family, okay? It's a very convoluted, just yucky kind of situation, okay? So Aristobulus, who was one of the daughters of Herod the Great, had a daughter whose name was Herodias. So the niece of Herod Philip, apparently very attractive, very desirable, very seductive in regards to history. She's discussed in those terms. Herod Philip determines to make her his wife. Now, Herod Antipas previously had been arranged in marriage to King Areta, the king of Petra, in a political marriage. But for some reason, the government of Rome brought both Herod Agrippa and Herod Philip back to Rome for some type of conference, some type of meeting. And when they went back to Rome, Herod Antipas with his wife, the daughter of Areta, I forget her name, and then Herod Philip with his wife Herodias, they met up at some conference, some session, right? And Herod Antipas realized, I like his wife better than mine. Who would have thought it, right? Who would have thought my brother got the pick of the litter, kind of thing? I don't like that kind of thing. And Herod Antipas made a play for Herodias. Herodias was looking actually to climb the power structure ladder there. I thought maybe that Herod Antipas was going to ascend to a more dominant position, a more ruling position than Herod Philip. And so she hitches her wagon to another uncle. and marries Herod Antipas. Now, Herod Antipas had to divorce his wife, started a war with the region of Petra over it. He divorced his wife, married Herodias. It's a very messed up family, okay? Truth be told. Here, Herod married Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. Now, they're legally married, okay, by law. And it's all kind of legal in the Roman Empire. It's just not godly. And I think this is a really important point. We're going to see this in verse 4. It's a really important point and distinction to make in all of our lives. That we recognize that what's legal is not necessarily godly, and what's godly may not always necessarily be legal. And it's important that we function according to the higher standard and calling, right? Now people, in regards to kind of marriage definitions of the modern day, or what America is doing in regards to marriage, in regards to, gender and sexuality and a lot of these kinds of things. People, what's legal now? It doesn't matter, right? There are a lot of things that are allowed in this country that are still very clearly ungodly. And that's what John is speaking against. Not what broke the law, but what broke God's order, what broke his law. So in verse 4, John had said to him, it's not lawful for you to have her. Now, this is John the Baptist. He doesn't mind getting up in anybody's grill. right? Like, John doesn't mind offending just about anybody if in fact they're wrong. Herod Antipas, the king over this region, marries his own niece, who was somebody else's wife. John's like, it's not right. It's just not right. Shouldn't have done it. Now, John the Baptist's words get to the palace, right? Herod Agrippa hears that there's a prophet out in the desert speaking bad things about him. He sends his soldiers out there to get him and puts him into prison for it. Could have left well enough alone, but does not. And John had spoken up against this. Now, many of you guys have heard me say this before, in that I don't like the fact that the animosity and difficulty, persecution by and large, that comes against the church right now is on such weird terms, right? You've heard me say this before. I would wish that I could be persecuted for arguing justification by faith alone in Christ alone, right? Like Martin Luther in the 1500s, right? I could wish that I could be persecuted for the translation of the scriptures into the modern tongue, into the current language, like happened for Huss and Zwingli and many, many others throughout Wycliffe, throughout church history, right? Who wanted to take the Bible out of Latin and put it into the language of the common people, but the power structures of the church did not like that because they wanted control over what God had said and made it be whatever they benefited off of it most. And these other people came along and said, no, listen, God's word is for everybody, not just for the leaders, right? Not just for people who could benefit off of it. Get persecuted for it. In the modern day, we're probably not going to be persecuted for arguing kind of justification by faith. You might get persecuted for arguing the fact that Jesus is the only way to heaven, right? That might come up, right, in regards to an issue. The main issues in our society are dumb, right? Gender issues. Like, we're trying to figure out what a gender is. And is actually gender the same as biological sex? And no? Well, then who makes up what? How do we figure out what this is? And who gets to pick? Today I feel like a guy. Today I feel like a woman. Tomorrow I might feel like who knows kind of thing, and I can just call that whatever it is, right? As long as I say that I'm sincere. And you have to accept that as true in my life. And then treat me that way, right? I'm not Michael today, I'm Michelle, right? Yes, it's dumb, right? Is this how dumb this is, right? Kind of thing. Very confusing. Very confusing. And listen, you're raising children having children, the world is going to get way more confusing than it is now, right? Because now it's being promoted. Now it's being taught at higher levels as the better way to do things. I know families whose kids, in an effort to get some type of recognition, some type of, acceptance, some type of just acknowledgement, because they're probably hidden, their parents are divorced or they're split and they're not getting a lot of attention. And so one of the easiest ways is, oh, by the way, Mom, I think I'm actually the opposite gender. And now you're getting a lot of attention and treated very special. And it's very, very dangerous because it's so confusing, right? It is very interesting to me that with all of these questions and the greater liberties and freedoms that are given to teenagers now, that the suicide rates are spiking in connection to those very same trends. You would think, right, you give kids greater freedom, that the tension in their life would decrease and that the risk of suicide would go down. That's not how this is working because we got it all mixed up. Right? We don't know what we're doing. We're backwards. Right? Truth, structure, boundaries, biblical definitions create a sense of stability and health in a person's mind that needs to be ingrained in a kid when they are 5 and 4 and 3 years old. And that actually produces health and structure. Breaking those walls down creates an instability and a greater loss. All right? Well, we're living in this day, for me, to stand up and say something like that in the wrong arena would probably get me fired. There are some church systems now. To stand up and say something like that would literally get me fired. All right? And I hate the fact that this seems to be the arena in which the battle in our country is being fought. And I've hated that for a really long time. It just annoys me. It feels like we've elevated sexuality to such a degree in our country that it's almost like the greatest arguments are fought on that arena, and it's not the most noble area of human life. It's not even like it's that important. It's not that important. We treat it like it is the most important, and it's not. Love, sacrifice, right? Dying on somebody else's behalf, laying down your life, helping somebody else out. Those are much higher. We just don't ever talk about those things. Elevate this. It's just silly to me, right? But then I realize, for better, for worse, that John the Baptist got thrown into prison for speaking about somebody else's marriage. So it may not be so different even in the modern day than it even was for John. Not that I think it's good for him or for me to be persecuted in this arena, but it just kind of is maybe what it is. Well, verse 5 says, although Herod Antipas wanted to put him to death, he feared the multitude because he counted him as a prophet. Herod Antipas was a bit ambivalent regarding John the Baptist. Some days he'd like to hear from John. John was novel and probably carried very strong opinions that were very different than Herod Antipas. Other days he wanted to kill Herod Antipas and just didn't because the people would have revolted if they had killed him without cause. In verse 6 it says, now Herod's birthday was celebrated. So he has a birthday. With a king's birthday is a big party, a big festival. And it says here that the daughter of Herodias danced before all of the men in this party. Typically, they'd have the men in one side and the women in the other side doing these festivals and feasts. By the time this young lady comes out, the men are no doubt drunk, no doubt kind of in some rowdy kind of fashion, and they bring some woman in here to dance before them seductively, sexually, and it says here that it pleased Herod. Now, it just so happened that the girl here that comes in and does this dance is his own stepdaughter. I told you this family's weird, right? This family is messed up, right? His own stepdaughter, her name was Salome. History says that she was probably around 16 years old at the time of this dance. And she came in and put on such a show. Now, no doubt at the instruction of Herodias, her mom, who happened to be Herod Antipas's wife, right? If anybody knew how to seduce Herod Antipas, it would have been Herodias, right? She gives instructions to her own daughter, who pulls this off in front of all of the other men of the kingdom invited to this feast, to the degree that Herod, in whatever beer muscles he's demonstrating here in this scene, makes a promise. It says in verse 7 that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. He stands up in this whole thing, oh, it's all good, and he's sweating, aroused and excited, and everybody's hooting and hollering. He's kind of, hey, I promise you can have up to half the kingdom. He just makes this bold statement in front of everybody. It's exactly what Herodias wanted, because it says here that Salome, so she in verse 8, having been prompted by her mother, so she's like, time out. Hold right there. I need to have a consult here, a huddle with the coach before we make this final decision here. Just hold on. She goes over to mom. Hey, mom, half the kingdom. We can have it's a good day. That was a very productive dance. Made half the kingdom on it. What do you want to kind of do with it, kind of thing? Prompted by her mother, Herodias says, give me John the Baptist's head here on a platter. This lady could have anything in the kingdom, and the only thing she wants is this prophet dead. That's how in her crawl he is. That's how in her spirit, in her soul he has become. Do not discount the significance of God's word spoken even to the people in the highest authority and the highest powers. Right? It may not produce a change and a conversion, but it doesn't mean that it goes without notice. This digs something in her that she has to deal with. And she thinks the best way to deal with it is to kill John the Baptist. Now, verse 9 says that the king was sorry. Nevertheless, because of the oaths and because of those who sat with him, he commanded it to be given to her. He's got too much arrogance and pride to back down from this promise, right? But he is the king, and he could have easily said, listen, anything but that. Actually, instead, we're going to release him. It's not fair to have him in prison. He could have done anything to make this right. But his pride, he feels bound to this. So he says to give the head of John the Baptist to Salome. It says in verse 10, so he sent and had John beheaded in prison. And his head was brought on a platter, a silver platter that they would use to serve food. His head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and then she immediately then went and took it and gave it to her mother. And then it says in verse 12 that the disciples came and took away the body and buried it and went and told Jesus. I've oftentimes imagined John the Baptist in that prison, in the prison Machaerus, where he was held. John the Baptist was a man who was accustomed to living out in the desert. Locusts and wild honey were just fine for him, right? He didn't need caviar and sushi and fancy, champagne and fancy food, and he didn't need fancy clothes. He didn't need high-end, kinds of ends. He was very comfortable, just kind of living right off the earth. And I think to some degree believed it was better for his spirit to live unattached from the things that people could use to pull his strings. I think to some degree for all of us, we need to be very, very careful about the things that we grow to depend upon. Because if we're not careful and we don't resurrender them on a regular basis, the world will pull those strings and we will end up somewhere we do not want to be. Because how can I ever live without this, right? How can I ever live without health care? Well, how about the same way everybody else in the history of humankind has done it up until maybe the last 300 or 400 years? Healthcare is not necessary. It's a grace. It's a benefit. Use it when you got it. Great. The government wants to give it to you. Fine. Whatever, right? But they come along and say, well, if you believe that, say that, do that, you can't have this anymore. You can have it back, right? I don't want your hospitals anyway, kind of thing. You don't need them, right? I've oftentimes thought I could move to a third world country and die in peace, right? Of whatever gets me next. Oswald Chambers was 26 years old, serving in the British Army, but he was in North Africa. I think it was Ethiopia. A ruptured appendix and died away from home, away from his family. It could have been fixed. Could have been, but it wasn't. Well, how would God ever let that happen? It does, right? Murray McShane. So many throughout the history of the church did not live long lives. It was the man that died at the hands of the Auca Indians. I'm getting his name wrong in my head. Years ago. He said, "Dear Jesus, don't give me a long life. Give me a full one like yours." I don't need a long life. I just want a full one. I want a meaningful life. I want a significant life. I want an impactful life. Length of it is not the necessary thing, right? Well, whatever it is that we may kind of feel committed to, obligated to, feel like it's necessary to have, to live, we've got to be careful. Because the world will end up pulling those strings. They will end up using them against us. John lived clear of any of that stuff. Didn't need any of it. Didn't care about any of it. Almost seemed to reject it outright. Hated anybody who would even kind of commit to these kinds of, didn't want any part of it. Right? And so therefore his message could be so clear. He was uncontrolled and unmanipulated by anybody. Right? To the degree that he was willing to tell the truth to the king. The same truth that got him thrown into prison.
We learn that John's story ends in a way that feels painfully unfair and unjust, undeserved and hard for us to make sense of. A faithful man who stood for truth finishes his days in a dungeon, wrestling with doubt and ultimately losing his life at the whim of corrupt leaders. But his life reminds us that faithfulness isn't defined by our circumstances, but by the God who holds our whole story in his hands. John calls us to trust God even when the outcome feels wrong, and to keep walking with him when we don't understand the why. All right, that's all for now. Thanks for listening to the Word for the Valley podcast. So long, everyone.